Geologist and geoscience writer Andrew Alden joins the Plutopia podcast this time. We discuss his book, Deep Oakland, inspired by the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake. Andrew gives us a guided tour of Oakland's history and geology.
It's a new kind of book. Any of you, if you wanted to, you could write a book like that for your own city. And I'm not declaring a franchise, but I'm saying Deep Oakland is a new type of book. And I hope that it gets a wider readership and inspires more books like it. I don't have to write every book. You know, the more authors who can do this, the better. I want to wake the world up to what modern geology has to offer. Geology is not your grandfather's geology. It's your grandchildren's geology. It's the geology of the 21st century. It's the geology the 21st century needs as we face a terrible restructuring of the world economy.
This is the Plutopia podcast featuring my partner in crime, Scoop Sweeney, and our guest today, Andrew Alden. Andrew is a geologist, a geoscience writer, and he's worked for the U.S. Geological Survey and reported for KQED and Bay Nature out in the Bay Area. Alden has a long fascination with rocks and landscapes, and I have to tell you, his book, which we're going to be talking about today, Deep Oakland, is a beautifully written book that tells you pretty much everything you ever wanted to know about the geology of Oakland. And if you don't get enough from the book, he also has a blog, which we'll talk about. Andrew, welcome.
Nice to be on Plutopia.
We're so happy to have you. I wanted to start with a couple of quotes from the book. One is, which really I thought was great, "Nothing is permanent to a geologist." And then the other was, "The entire planet is now our intimate partner. Slowly it's sinking in that we have powers that we didn't know and obligations we didn't recognize." Those are fine quotes. And I guess a good way for us to start is with you defining geology. What is geology?
Yeah, well, people have this idea that and every geology writer and geologist has to cope with it, that geology is about rocks, it's about fossils, it's about, dusty old guys standing out in the field with rock hammers. And yeah, that's a beautiful and important tradition of geologists. But geology is really about how the planet Earth works. And even more generally, now that we have super space telescopes that are studying worlds and other star systems, geology is actually the study of how solid bodies work, how planets work, everywhere in the universe. And so it's kind of a coming to fruition of a long time dream that we've had. Now, it's not just about rocks. Rocks are the tissues of worlds. And now we can go all the way into the hot cores of planets and the tectonics of how they stir and move. And we actually have a handle on what causes earthquakes and volcanoes. And when it comes to cities, every city has a new story that it didn't have before. It has a geological story that is well grounded, all the way down to the Earth's core, and it gives you such a huge context for this new kind of storytelling that it really struck me as I was studying Oakland, because it's a great place to learn geology in all of its depth, not just the gravel beds and the landforms and stuff. And so I'm really glad to speak to people outside Oakland, because every city has the same potential, even Austin.
Well, I'm particularly interested in hearing what you have to say because I lived in the Bay Area for about 40 years, 20 of them in my house in East Oakland, in the foothills. And I was actually a victim of the geology when we had the Loma Prieta earthquake. It
Aha.
managed to roll my foundation over, which got kind of expensive. And but I saw a lot of the quirks of the geology, the Hayward Fault and the rock quarries. I believe you had mentioned them that were inflicted upon the landscape early on, and there was one in our neighborhood that was pretty notorious. So I can't wait to hear what you think about the way people have developed around the Hayward Fault.
Yeah, that's part of my earlier point that um, when we learned about the Hayward Fault was after the city had expanded across it. You know, what the last time the Hayward Fault ruptured, when we actually had an idea of what it could do, when it broke the ground and, ripped it open the earth, was in 1868. And at the time, that part of Oakland was just a few farms. That there was a country estate out there, and they recorded, oh yeah, it had lots of damage. But it was forgotten. And so when Oakland expanded, and then the geologists got involved, and they realized, starting in the late 40s, that the Hayward Fault is actually active. It's not just an earthquake fault; it's a creeping fault. It moves between earthquakes all the time, and in California we're used to that. Now we've learned that if you go down to Hollister, for instance, south of the Bay Area, it's kind of people know about it. This is part of our city fabric. It's kind of we have a California attitude to it. We're used to disasters all the time, and of course maybe down in coastal Texas and Galveston and so on. They have a bit of the same fatalistic attitude. Nature, or tornado country, nature is going to have its way with us one way or another. We do what we can, but we can't do everything. But it's still a big problem. It's not just some colorful aspect of our local geography. We have freeways built on the fault. We've got power lines and water lines and so on. And the state, the region, and the city, they've been working on that. But we've done we take care of the real essentials, but deep down, there's still a lot to do. Individual houses, like the place you lived in, they have to have their foundations built, rebuilt, and strengthened. We all need to have emergency kits so that we can survive without power for a while.
There's a geologist, Stephen Newton, who I found where he had referred to the Hayward Fault as the most dangerous fault in America. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. I think that's because the potential for dollar damage is about as high as it gets in this whole country. It's as simple as that. We've got major cities from Fremont and Oakland. The railroads cross it. There's just so much valuable property right on the fault. We've got the LDS Church built a temple on top of it in 1968. Well, they say we have a prophecy that temple will be destroyed. And yeah, well, that's,
yes, indeed.
That's kind of I appreciate that attitude. It's a gold rush attitude. It's a deeply Californian attitude that, Here we are, we're living in a landslide, basically, and all we can do is kind of enjoy it, make the most of it. Life is a roll of the dice.
What do you think of people who decide to build on the Hayward Fault? I mean, are they
Well, they shouldn't do
ignorant?
it anymore. It's just got to be forbidden, and the state, thank goodness, has forbidden it. We have mapped all of the active earthquake faults as near as we can tell, because there's still a lot of faults we don't know about yet. But the ones we know about, we have mapped, and the state forbids you to build new buildings within 50 feet of these mapped traces. And so that's good as far as it goes for new construction. Now, if you've got an old building right on the fault, even if the fault kind of rips it apart, if you can repair it, you can stay there. If you have an apartment building on it and it rips off a corner of a building, if you can repair it, you can still, lease it to people. And when you sell property, you're supposed to inform the would-be buyer that they're sitting on an earthquake fault. And yeah, that's down in the fine print, but it doesn't really sink in. I have a lot of people regularly, I wouldn't say a lot, but regularly people write me and say, I'm looking at this property and it's mapped right on the fault. And I say, I'm not a professional, I'm not a licensed geologist. I can't advise you. However, that is true, It's a funny position to be a geologist in Oakland.
Can you describe what you would expect to see in the next earthquake along the Hayward Fault, the next really serious earthquake?
It's going to be awful. I don't like to dwell on it, because I live here too. I have the same rolling the dice attitude. But yeah, it'll be heavy shaking. It'll be shaking as if you got each of you, if you're standing there and you got picture two professional football players at your shoulders on either side, and they're shoving you back and forth between them. They're just standing there pushing you back and forth nonstop for 30 seconds, 40 seconds. That's how long the heavy shaking will last. If you stand there with a stopwatch and imagine that, and then you imagine your apartment, bookcases are falling down, their lights are flashing on and off, your computer is saying messages at you. The car alarms out on the street have all started. Earthquakes supposedly sound like standing next to a freight train at high speed, or airplanes flying close overhead. It's just an awful description, and I can't say I've ever felt it. You and I, Scoop, we lived through the '89 earthquake, and yeah, you just felt a lot of moving around, Wouldn't you say? Wasn't that how it was?
Yes, I was actually in an elevator at the headquarters building for Kaiser Permanente. I was a IT person for Kaiser for many years, and I was in the elevator going to pick up my wife, who was an accountant, in a couple of floors down, and on the way between floors, it hit, and I know what a margarita feels like when it's in a blender, and that was essentially it. And
Yeah.
that's something I've remembered a lot. One important edifice that's close to the Hayward Fault, UC Berkeley, the Lawrence Berkeley Labs. I mean, if it hits there, it's not only going to destroy a lot of important scientific work, but there are a lot of students who are right in that area.
Yeah, that's the damage the earthquake does isn't just property. It will essentially end the school year, or whenever it happens. Hopefully it happens after finals, It's funny you bring up Lawrence Berkeley Lab. I was just up there the other week. We took a trip there with a Science Writers Association. They showed us the giant cyclotron, and they showed us the enormous computer system. And yeah, it's a football-sized building, and it's just a phalanx of top-of-the-line Cray supercomputers, like 100 of them, all wired up in parallel. But around that compound of supercomputers, there's this wide apron of steel plates. And those steel plates cover a trench that allows the whole computer unit to sashay back and forth, space isolation. It's state of the art. And so people are making these kind of steps. And at Lawrence Berkeley, yeah, they have the money to do it right. But so many other places don't. I can imagine you as the IT guy, you're standing there in the elevator and you're going, one, I hope the elevator keeps moving. Two, I'm an emergency responder. I got to get down to the server room and see what's happening.
That was exactly what happened. And
Yep.
what happened is a lot of people didn't have computers for a while. Fortunately, we were able to restore. But I mean, I ended up going and volunteering. That they wouldn't let us stay in the headquarters building because of all the damage. So I went up to the hospital and volunteered just to help because there were so many people that were, their homes were destroyed or they just couldn't get to work. So yeah, I ended up being a hospital worker for a few days. But that's what you have to do in a situation like that. You have to help where you can.
There's a role for as many people as want to get involved in earthquake response. And folks like IT people, they're part of the emergency response network. People in that role have been rehearsing. They do drills, they do tests. The Bay Area is a lot better off than it was 33 and a half years ago. So they're part way to being really resilient. They're always learning from places like Japan and Mexico and Turkey, where we had a terrible pair of earthquakes earlier this year. But that's, earthquakes. Earthquakes, I try to minimize it in Deep Oakland because the message of my book is you should go get to know the fault while it's still sleeping. Get to know it. It's the fault is part of us. In fact, Oakland wouldn't be the beautiful city it is. It wouldn't be that, you know how beautiful Oakland is. There's nothing quite like it. And it's all because of the Hayward Fault. It's because there's a geological story behind our geographic story. And that's what Deep Oakland is about. It's about finding this new dimension to love your city.
Yeah, you say that the Hayward Fault had a significant role in shaping the geology of Oakland, correct?
Very much so, yeah.
How did that work?
Well, the Hayward Fault is it's like all the Coast Range California faults, like San Andreas Fault. Most of the motion is sideways. One side slides past the other sideways. There's also a bit of compression across it. The two great plates, North America and the Pacific plates, aren't quite lined up in parallel. They're kind of pushing against each other and nudging each other at the same time. So, all that nudging on the several different faults that make up the boundary between those two plates. I liken it to a big semi merging onto a crowded freeway. You see it and you just make room for it. And when you talk about blocks of the Earth's crust, they push up the hills. And then the hills, they kind of weigh down on the fault and push down the other side. And so between them, that's how those lovely parallel ranges that make up the California Coast Range. They're quite different from what you see in the Rockies, what you see in Japan, for instance. Those are all convergent landscape features. The faults are moving directly toward each other. And coastal California, it's modified. It's kind of this, you know, transpressive tectonic regime. And I introduced the word, words like that. I seed them throughout the book. So by the end, the attentive reader will actually be able to, open up a journal article, journal paper, and kind of make sense of it. I really wanted to introduce people to the science, and I kind of nudged them toward the science in the same way.
While I was reading the book, I had Google Maps open, and I was moving around the area using Google Maps. I had been there recently, as you know, and I had some memory of the area, but I really didn't have the same overview. So I feel that I have learned a lot about Oakland from reading this book, because this isn't just a book about geology, it's also a book about history, right?
Yeah. The geology, by building landscapes, affects how how cities interact with that landscape. I explain why there was a nice body of good bedrock, very suitable for making roads and wharves and foundations. It just happened to be very close to where the first settlers settled. And that was one of the ingredients that made for a great city. And the same was true in San Francisco. Same is true in Austin. You've got some great, really world-class rock quarries outside Austin, where the famous Texas red granite comes from. We have whole buildings of it here in Oakland. And I go by these buildings and I pat my hand on it, and I feel how warm they are in the sun. I look at their crystals and I think about Texas.
It's true.
But the rock quarries, there was one that I was well acquainted with right around just above the MacArthur Freeway in the area around Mills College, big quarry on the side of the hills.
Yeah.
And one day coming home from work, I approached that area, and it was 580 was closed down because it had flooded. There was water that had built up in that abandoned quarry, and suddenly, the retention dam they had gave way because mainly of not neglect by the people responsible for maintaining that, and it just flooded that whole area, and it was apparently a regular thing, but they didn't think about all the underground streams and water sources that come down off of the Oakland Hills, and
Yeah.
you've written about how the quarries were kind of inflicted upon the landscape. Is that correct? It was
Well,
a good thing for
the quarries were started when they were started. They were way out in the country, and of course, Oakland is all about spreading suburbia. Oakland is actually a suburban city. Like, it's got a little downtown core with tall buildings, and they didn't, if you didn't have permits, it was just out in the country. You could do anything you wanted. It's a legacy of an unregulated past, and part of the story of Piedmont. This is that body of rock that I explained was just happened to be very close to where rocks were needed. It later became a very exclusive little city. Oakland has a little city inside it named Piedmont. It's kind of the Atherton of the East Bay. It's very wealthy. And they used to have the quarries up there, but they quickly became undesirable. They would be blasting 3 times a day, and then the quarries were abandoned. They left behind pits full of water, and the local kids go down and swim in them, and occasionally one drowns, and so on. Now, these quarries impose costs on the future, and it's, every area has that problem in one way or another, whether it's, coal mining districts that have acid drainage, or it's mostly rock quarries leave the problems. And Oakland has like a couple dozen of them, and I love them as a geologist because they exposed the bedrock. And I love that part, but they don't make good neighbors.
I recall you say in the book that Oakland was really built, I guess it's kind of like a sand dune, right? Or dune sand, the kind of sand you find on a dune.
Yeah.
And how was that sand formed?
Yeah, the heart of downtown Oakland, where Oakland was actually founded in 1850, is an unusual piece of land. It's a level shelf of land that lies 20, 30 feet above the bay. And that's not like most of the bay. San Francisco was founded at a little anchorage where the ocean, where the bay was deep enough for ships to come, close to shore and land. It had a nice natural harbor. And in Oakland, it was quite similar. It wasn't quite so deep near shore, but it had that shoreline structure, a place where you could build wharves without much work. But anyway, yeah, that's the part that's made of sand dunes, which turns out to be just like the sand dunes that cover San Francisco and make it such a well, it's an interesting place. In Oakland, it was beautiful land. The local Indian tribe, the Ohlonies, had maintained it as an oak grove. It was a lovely grove of coast live oaks, and they'd come through and burn it every few years just to clear the underbrush and clean out the trees. And to the gold rush, people who crossed the bay looking at it, looking for new prospects, they said, this is a ready-made place for a great little city. We could have ready-made estates for our wealthy friends, and we could all have nice estates with lots of nice well water and mature trees. We could have ourselves a nice little suburb over here, and we could build wharves and maybe turn it into a neat little city. And it was just because of that body of sand dunes. It's almost unique in the East Bay. It has two neighbors, one where the city of Alameda is, and another little one down near the Oakland airport called Bay Farm Island. But so that was, when I was writing the book, I realized this is a whole nother dimension of Oakland that no other city in California has.
I'm also interested in Merritt Lake. You talking about Merritt Lake? It's not
Merritt, please. Lake Merritt.
Oh, Lake Merritt, yes. Mm-hmm. So Lake Merritt is not exactly a lake, correct?
Yeah, it's a little arm of the sea, and like downtown Oakland, it's unique. There's nothing quite like it in the East Bay. It's this linear estuary that extends in from the coast a couple miles. And so, long story short, I spend half the book explaining it all, so it makes sense. But that lucky bedrock, the Hayward Fault, the cycles of the ice ages, they all combine in a lovely story that accounts for that lake. And I think that's one of my signal contributions of Deep Oakland, that it brings to light this whole new dimension of Oakland's crown jewel, Lake Merritt.
Yeah, the estuary concept. There's also the Oakland estuary, which is used for a lot of shipping. And I spent a lot of time there. I had some friends who were really into sailing, and they actually lived on sailboats out in the Oakland estuary, which is kind of yeah. Well, they weren't exactly homeless. They just didn't have a rooted home. They had a sailing home, and I got to know
It's a
the
great lifestyle for
estuary.
those who like that lifestyle.
Yeah.
I couldn't stand it, but bless
But
them.
but there's a lot of industry along there, and I had the unfortunate uh, encounter with the water there. We had a party, and I got thrown overboard, and that was some of the most polluted water I'd ever seen or experienced. I had to throw
Yeah.
those clothes away. And that's one of the
It's
problems with
better.
this.
It's better since then. I got to tell you, it's better since then. But still, swimming is still outlawed in Lake Merritt. Yeah. Anyway, you were saying.
Just the whole estuary concept. They have the Navy base that was there that was quite world famous, but it basically has been downsized like all the other you know military bases in the Bay Area.
Hmm.
The sand you talk about. That was a problem in San Francisco and in Oakland with the earthquakes, because when an earthquake occurs, you have the liquefaction of this underlying sand. And is that still a problem, or have they addressed that at all?
Well, the lowland is, in general, is prone to liquefaction during earthquakes, simply because the water table is shallow. There's layers of gravel that have been sitting there for a while, and they've settled down. And when you shake them up, an easy example is if you're at a beach by the ocean, right down by the surf, and you're playing in the sand and you start patting it. You just pat it a lot. It'll turn liquid. It'll get kind of glossy, and that's what liquefaction is. You shake it. All the grains of sand that normally are interlocking and supply strength, they lose contact with each other, and so it becomes a slurry. So yeah, different parts of the coast are prone to liquefaction in different ways. And Oakland's downtown sand dunes are, as far as I can tell, not prone to liquefaction in the same way that the coastal marshes were. And a good example of that happened during the '89 earthquake. There was a major freeway that ran across that ground, the cypress structure. It was a weird double-decker freeway that kind they don't make anymore. And part of it was on Merritt sand, and part of it was on landfill. That was it used to be coastal marsh. They covered it with landfill a long time ago. And that was the part that failed. That was the part that liquefied, and it collapsed that freeway. A bunch of people died on it. Their cars got flattened. The only reason there weren't a lot more is because it happened to be during the 1989 World Series. It was game 2 of the World Series between Oakland and San Francisco, the Giants and the Athletics. And it was at 5 o'clock. Everybody was off the roads. They were all either at the ballpark or they were at home getting ready to watch it on TV. And, I was off the road. You were off the road. You were going down the elevator because it was quitting time, But anyway, yeah, that's 1989. That was liquefaction. It is kind of an unknown factor in the Oakland Harbor, that large area of landfill that's been built over the last 100 years, starting around 1860. Nowadays, we're better at building landfill than we used to be. I kind of think that the landfill was probably pretty good because it was built by the railroads. It was not just built willy-nilly by, every other person, the way San Francisco's waterfront happened. What San Francisco's waterfront is notorious, the landfill around San Francisco. That was the kind of landfill we saw in the Marina District, where a whole bunch of housing was destroyed. A lot of people lost their homes in '89. But in the gold rush, 1,000 ships came in and only like 100 of them left because everybody abandoned ship in 1850. They said, we're heading out to the gold fields. And so they just leave the ships where they were. Sometimes they, build a bridge out to them and make a saloon out of them or something, but they generally just buried them in mud. And so the old waterfront on that part of San Francisco and down around the Mission District is just terrible landfill. We saw it fail in 1906 and we saw it fail again in 1989. In Oakland, we didn't see that. So I'm not saying we're great, but we are better than some places.
I'm wondering about the role of exploitation and extraction in the development of Oakland and in the way the geology has evolved there.
Yeah, Oakland has a surprising variety there too. And not only do we have rock quarries in the hills, we have huge amounts of landfill and dredging down in the flats. But we even have a little pyrite mine up in the hills. So we have some real, Appalachian style mine drainage, acid mine drainage that comes from that. So that was another thing I liked personally, simply as a book author. If you live up there, it's pretty benign. People don't rely on the streams for their water, but there's a couple of streams up there that are orange. The stream beds are lined with orange iron oxides, which come from the breakdown of pyrite in the rocks. Pyrite is a iron sulfide mineral, and so when it gets attacked by sulfur digesting bacteria or simply air and water, the sulfur turns into sulfuric acid and the iron turns into iron oxides. And so there's a whole geology lesson there, which occupies chapter 10, just before I get to the real rocks now. Deep Oakland is really, it's about, I start with the fault and then I talk a lot about the landscape and the young geological features. These are things people can relate to. I wanted to ease them into talking about rocks. I don't want to start out with rocks.
Well, one of the benefits, if you will, of the faults is they've created some great land features, the mountains, the hill, the amazing hills up and down the California coast. And so I would see that as a real benefit because just amazing places to go and see.
Yep. Oakland is it's a great city, but it's also a great coast range city. It's a great California city. Its growth, its setting, and its human history and its geologic history have echoes all up and down the California coast. And so I anticipated a wider readership for this. There are possibilities of a sequel. I don't know if I want to do that, but one thing I've said to my followers on Twitter who are geologists all over the world, I'm telling them it's a new kind of book. Any of you if you wanted to, you could write a book like that for your own city. And I'm not declaring a franchise, but I'm saying Deep Oakland is a new type of book. And I hope that it gets a wider readership and inspires more books like it. I don't have to write every book. The more authors who can do this, the better. I want to wake the world up to what modern geology has to offer. Geology is not your grandfather's geology. It's your grandchildren's geology. It's the geology of the 21st century. It's the geology the 21st century needs as we face a terrible restructuring of the world economy. We really need earth science in the coming century. And that was another one of my big motivations of writing Deep Oakland. I hope some of that sinks in.
Well, there's a term I've heard you use that actually we also heard recently in an interview we did with somebody about virtual reality, and it's human geology. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things that struck me about this book is it's really a book about human geology, right?
Yeah, I wanted to introduce geology as people. And I was lucky enough that, I've just been really lucky to live in Oakland and realize this book. But in chapter 4, I pay a visit to our another world-class thing that Oakland has, which is a gorgeous cemetery. It's like Forest Lawn. It's like the great cemeteries in Brooklyn, New York, and Arlington, and so on. It's a beautiful world-class cemetery. The landscape design was by Frederick Law Olmsted, who was famous for New York Central Park, and so on. And it happens to have the graves of some interesting geologists in it too. And it's an interesting landscape. And so chapter 4 is I really tried to bring in the human side of that and the human side of geology and a bit of its history going all the way back to the 1660s and the 1780s.
Who are some of the geologists that are buried there?
Well, we have, the first one I visited was Joseph LeConte. Joseph LeConte is famous at UC Berkeley because he was one of the first faculty members there they hired in 1869. They said, we want this eminent geologist and chemist to build a world-class faculty. And he did, he did. And he taught generations of students. He had a lovely textbook. I have a copy of one of his later editions on my shelf. He was also a dyed-in-the-wool Georgia racist. He was raised on a plantation where, as a boy, he was surrounded by Negro servants who treated him well. They took him out on horseback and showed him in the woods. He had this idealistic boyhood that a plantation kid would have. And he thought that was all there was to it. He never had to wield a whip or sell a human being in the marketplace, So he was kind of a blind racist. And he felt that way his whole life. And so, I go into that. I say, well, our heroes are mixed people. Another famous geologist is Nick Tolliver. And every Coast Range geologist knows his name, He walked 50,000 miles all over the rocks. He taught generations. He led the field camp for UC Berkeley for 33 years. Those are really important institutions in the profession. Now, of course, neither of those gentlemen welcomed women. Tolliver was more tolerant than LeConte. He was not a stone racist, but he was a Kentucky kid. He had some, So, I go into some of those people, but they all have good legacies as well as bad. And I go into the legacy of geology itself. Geology has a bad reputation, one, because it still is dominated by white men. And we know that. We know it's a problem. We're working on doing more outreach, welcoming women and minorities. It's important work. But there is this cowboy legacy we have because geologists helped lead the westward expansion.
My wife wanted to be a geologist, and
she should go back and she should keep.
She was talked out of it at the time. She was really, really interested in it, really ready to go. And
women are entering geology more than ever, and it's been a great development to see. Women, in fact, make up the majority of geology students these days. That doesn't mean that we have parity yet, because they still face uphill fights when it comes to the workplace, academic settings, and so on. But there is progress being made. We're doing outreach to the professional societies are doing outreach to underrepresented groups. There are Black geoscientist societies. There are Native American geological societies. There's work being done to bring everyone to the table, and that's important because, as I say, the world needs every geologist they can get. A geology degree is a great preparation for all kinds of lifestyles. And I think being exposed to geology during your education, whether it's in college or a high school, is a great thing for citizens. So that's another one of the things I wanted to do with Deep Oakland, is just encourage more people of all
kinds. Were you watching his bandwidth? Did it drop there?
Stores are and where things are like that. But I want people to get underneath everything, because, as I put it, where we are is who we are.
I think a lot of the interest in geology in Texas was people were thinking of petroleum geology, but I'm sure it's a much broader field than that, and much work to be done, huh?
Texas has a glorious history in the oil and gas, but its time is passing.
Well, I want to thank you, Andrew. I think we're close to the end of our hour here, and one thing I wanted to be sure to do is to again show the cover of your book.
Yeah.
Deep Geology, which is an excellent book and a great read. And, if you think, well, I don't live anywhere near Oakland, I don't think I need this book, forget it. You should read this book. Everybody should read it.
Everybody should visit Oakland,
It's true. It's true. And I don't know why they don't. And we should also...
San Francisco's a pretty cool place, too.
Yeah, absolutely. But we should also mention that you have a blog, and I thought I had it up here, and I'm not finding it.
We'll be sure and post a link to that on the podcast.
Yeah, we'll put a link to it on the podcast. Give me 1 second here. I'll bet I can find it here. Oakland Geology. Okay. I am going to show that site right now. There we are. Oakland Geology. So thanks so much, Andrew. And we would like you to come back sometime and we can talk some more about geology.
Sure. some other place, some other time.
Thank you.
It's
Excellent.
great hanging out with you guys.
Yeah, this has been great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
You can follow the Plutopia News Network at plutopia.io. On Facebook, go to @Plutopia News. On Twitter, it's @Plutopia. With John Lepkowski, I'm Scoop Sweeney. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.